build trust, and that's a key component to what makes co-management work so well. You don't have to come in with regulations and restrictions. You can talk to the people that you work with all the time and say, this is the reason why we need to do this, and people understand based on the science and the collar data, and also what harvesters and people who are in the land are saying. So you build that rapport of working together, and there's trust there, which really helps for managing these species.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Carrie. That would have been horrible if we had this big line chat and we forgot to record it. Thank you. Well, welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast, and I'm super excited today to have two really special guests, Jennifer Smith and Billy Storr from Yukon, and also joined today by co-host Carrie Staples, who's been doing so much work to coordinate everybody in Yukon, and so happy, Carrie, with all of the quality of guests that you've been able to bring on the podcast. And what makes me so excited about Jennifer and Billy is just the fact that combined, you have so many years of experience directly in co-management. Like, we've talked to a lot of people on the podcast that might have been academics or studying the topic and so on, but we want to hear from more chairs and executive directors and knowledge holders. So I think that's where the real co-management is happening at that level. So we always like to start off the podcast just by getting people to introduce themselves and share a little bit about how you got into co-management and so on. And happy for you both to draw straws, or we could start with Jennifer or Billy, whichever way you want to go.
I can go.
Okay, go ahead, Billy.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Billy Storr, and I got into co-management probably, I guess, the first time I went and got on the Aullaviat HTC. And just before that, I had done a couple of years of taking a college course on natural resources and technology, and that was, I was in construction before that, and that was about, when I graduated from that 2-year diploma course, I turned 50, so we had my two youngest sons were in high school, so my wife went, and she's a teacher. She retired with 37 years teaching experience, so we needed another year for our two youngest boys to finish their education in Anguniarvik, so I took a natural resources and technology diploma program, and I graduated from that. And then when I got back home, they said, you know what you need to do? You need to get on the Aullaviat HTC. So I did that, and within the first year, they made me president, and I sat on the Aullaviat HTC for 15 years, like continuously, and all those years I sat also as a rep on the Aullaviat Game Council. So I've been in and about there most of my life, and I'm still currently the president for the Aullaviat HTC. So we, at the start, there wasn't too much in the co-management process, but we plugged along, and now that everything we do is co-management, the working with our co-management partners and managing our wildlife and our lands and waters and stuff. So I've been there for a while. And I also sit on a couple of other boards. I sat on the Porcupine Caribou Herd management board for probably now for 18 or 19 years. I'm well versed in the co-management process.
You definitely are, and that's what I'm excited to hear more about, definitely shortly. And Jennifer, you've had a lot of different roles too before ascending to the chair role and whatnot. Maybe you could tell us a bit about who you are and your experience in co-management.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Not as many roles as Billy and not as much experience as him, and he also didn't mention that he's the vice chair for our council, the Wildlife Management Advisory Council for the North Slope. So he's certainly got decades of experience stacked up on top of me. But my work in this world is through the Wildlife Management Advisory Council, North Slope. And I was kind of thinking about your question about how did I get involved in co-management. And I'd like to say that it was about the area and the cool wildlife that live in the area that we manage for and make recommendations for. But actually, what really got me into this was the people. And I heard about this really cool wildlife board that did interesting work up on the North Slope. And so the first thing I did was go to their website and say, I wonder if I could get a job with these people. Who are these people? And I looked at the website and I scrolled through the names, and they were all really well-known names to me. And one of them is actually Kiri's dad, who was the previous chair of this council. Excuse me. And I'd come across him in other work before. I knew him as a facilitator, and I kind of respected the work that he did. There were other really cool people on that website, like Dorothy Cooley, who'd been a biologist in the region for decades, and I knew she had so much knowledge, and Wendy Nixon and Doug Larson and all of these people that were these like big names to me. And also this area that I didn't know very much about. I grew up in the Yukon, but I grew up in the southern Yukon, and so around Whitehorse. So I kind of knew that we had a coast, but I really didn't know very much about it. So through that website, I kind of looked around and thought, I wonder if one day I could make it to Herschel Island. That seems like such a neat place to go. I applied for a job with the council, and I started with the council in about 2007, I think. And I was covering a maternity leave when I started. So I thought, I'll just like dip my toe into this, and I'll probably just stay for 8 months and it'll be a good experience. But here I am, I think 15, 16, 17 years later, and I could never leave. And the reason I couldn't leave is once I started working with those people and actually getting into the communities and understanding and starting to learn about co-management and how these processes work, I got really interested, and it felt like meaningful work. And it felt like the place that I wanted to be involved in that we're making decisions together, but not only that, they're grounded in the community. We're talking to the people who live there, like Billy Storr. We're talking to people who are harvesting. They're letting us know what they're seeing. And then we're sitting with government representatives and hearing about regulations and hearing about what's actually possible to make recommendations, and sitting at the table together. It seemed like a place where I wanted to be involved in. So here I am. I was staff for the council for many years, and more recently, over the past about 2.5 years, I accepted the role as chair, which has been a privilege to be able to sit in this role.
And Carrie, we keep hearing about your dad on this podcast, but he has yet to appear. Are we making progress with tracking down Lindsay Staples?
Yeah, I make no guarantees. He is he's elusive, even if you're related to him and currently staying in his house. So we'll get him eventually.
Okay, perfect. No, I know Lindsay as well, and certainly want to have him on here and learn about all his contributions to the system as well. And one of the things that I'm curious to get your perspectives on is like what do you think has been the secret to co-management being so endearing in the Yukon? Like it's been going strong now for a long time, and I hear a lot of different stories across the country when we've been doing this podcast, but it seems like things started in many ways in the Yukon and are continuing to get even stronger, like with this most recent announcement with the protected area as an example. But any thoughts on what's kept it so strong? Maybe Billy?
Actually, for us, what's kept it so strong is because I think I realized early in my time with the Aullaviat Hunters and Trappers Committee that we needed, to be able to work with these other people, and you need to be able to communicate with them, and to be able to just to talk to them, because they have the same interests as we have, and maybe not the same mandate. Some of them are in government, some of them are in the other parts of the thing, but I think for anything to work, you have to have everybody together, to make things happen, and you have to be able to work with other co-management partners, because if you're not on the same page, things seem to take a long time to come to pass. And I think I learned early on that the more you interact with them and create a trusting, I guess, partnership with them, and you're able to move along a lot more quickly than if you were always trying to look out for your side of the story. And I think when you consider everybody else in the thing, and we all have a goal, and in these co-management regimes, and I think the better you work with them, the further you get ahead, and the more you get done. And I think like my interest is in with the community, and building something for our community. And I think over the years we had a really working, trusting relationship with all our co-management partners, and we've been able to go in leaps and bounds, in my thought of what should be happening in the community and being developed, and I think Aullaviat is kind of a leader in this, because we kind of caught on to this co-management process a lot quicker and been able to capitalize on it and to do things that we need to do for our membership. So I think that's a big lesson, and you learn to work with your co-management partners, and not, nobody wants to work with somebody that's always negative, and we always try to keep a positive attitude towards the things we're doing and the people we're working with, and it just goes a long ways.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be said for a positive attitude for sure. And I've always been interested in, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand the land claim agreement as well brings people together through like a biannual conference and whatnot. And there's probably no substitute for bringing people together so regularly like that and having funds for it. And it'd be interesting to share more about that conference with the listeners. I know there's one coming up, but just the history of it as well would be super interesting. And I think it is unique to your area.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit, and I might talk about it in kind of the jurisdictional context of the area. So as Jamie mentions, there is a conference that's actually baked right into the Aullaviat final agreement, and it's the only one that I'm aware of that's in a land claim agreement. Kind of a strange thing to have a provision for, is to have a conference to bring people together. But as Jamie said and Billy spoke to, it speaks to the ongoing collaboration of people in the region, and also kind of the complex jurisdictions. And I think that's one of the reasons the conference was envisioned to take place and continue over time. The conference is meant to happen every other year. We've moved that schedule to every 5 years just because it's kind of a Herculean effort to put on this conference. But we do have one coming up. But on the jurisdictional piece, I'll point out that Billy's actually not from the Yukon. He's from the Northwest Territories. And so our council is still about the Yukon North Slope. But if listeners look at a map, they'll see that Aullaviat is quite close to the Yukon border. And so the people from Aullaviat, they use the Yukon, they use the northern Yukon as part of their travel routes, and it's part of their traditional area that they would go. And so when you spoke about the strengths about co-management in the region, I think one of the big ones is this Aullaviat final agreement being signed 40 years ago. I think this year was 40 years. So that agreement, it spells out how we work, and it spells out how the Wildlife Management Advisory Council North Slope works. There's another council called the Wildlife Management Advisory Council for the Northwest Territories, and there's an Aullaviat Game Council and Hunters and Trappers committees that Billy spoke about, and a number of other co-management councils established under that land claim. Because that land claim was signed 40 years ago, people have had a long time to learn how to work together. And I would say that because a lot of, we call it the ISR, the Aullaviat Settlement Region, is in the Northwest Territories, and then there's some in the Yukon, the Northwest Territories have kind of been a leader in the ISR for how to do co-management really effectively. And when I say that, I mean that they have really good working relationships with the territorial government. And when these councils make recommendations to government, the government takes that recommendation really seriously. And I don't know of any circumstances where they wouldn't accept a recommendation from these co-management bodies. And then in transferring that over into the Yukon, we benefit from the longevity of that claim, and also these processes that have been established in the Northwest Territories. So we have that same model in the Northern Yukon, and then in I'll call it Southern Yukon, everything south of Old Crow, which isn't really that south, it's still pretty north, falls under a different agreement called the Umbrella Final Agreement. And within that framework, there are a number of other final agreements for Yukon First Nations, and they all have slightly different ways that they manage and co-manage. But one of the strengths for our region in the ISR is that the claim has been around for so long, and a lot of the people who worked on that claim and invested in the vision of that were still around to guide the direction of that. And it just is a really unique claim in that the vision was so clear for how people would work together. And having worked in some other areas of Yukon, I really admire the vision that was in this particular agreement for the strength of the co-management systems. So that was a long kind of detour to your question about the conference, but the conference is really special and unique because it brings people together from the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and also other regions in Canada. It's not just for the Yukon North Slope. That's the focus. And Jamie, you've attended one of our conferences before, but we try to make the theme relevant to issues that other largely co-management boards and agencies are grappling with. So, previous conference themes have been around how to meaningfully include traditional knowledge in decision-making, co-management, what's working well and what's not. And our upcoming conference, a plug for our upcoming conference in January, is about Indigenous conservation economies, how to keep people on the land connected to their traditional lands, as well as having them be able to have some kind of economy that keeps them being able to participate in those traditional ways of life. So we're really excited about that theme. We're in the planning phase now, and we're going to be circulating materials soon. And it kind of ties into work that we've been really focused on in the region of, Jamie mentioned it earlier, but working toward a designation of increased conservation recognition for an area of the North Slope. And Billy's kind of been the leader on that traditional conservation area agreement. So he could probably speak to that better than I.
Jennifer, I wonder if you could give us a little bit of background on why Indigenous economies was the topic for this year's conference.
Yeah, sure. So there's a bit of a longer history here, but I'll try to make it a little bit succinct. We spoke to one of the provisions in the land claim agreement of having this conference. Another provision is for our council to develop a wildlife conservation and management plan for the Yukon North Slope. So that's also baked right into that final agreement. So the council completed that plan and recommended it a couple of years ago, but it was just signed this past year by all of the parties in that region. And I spoke to the jurisdictional complexity. So that's the government of the Yukon, the government of Canada, it's the Aullaviat Game Council, and the Aullaviat Regional Corporation. So in that plan, the council worked for many, many years to document the wildlife and ecological values of the area, but also the traditional use values and the connection of people to those traditional areas. So in the development of that plan, there was a lot of conversation about, okay, we're documenting wildlife pretty well. We have a really good sense of what's going on the landscape with habitat. And we understand that the connection of people to the land is important. But how do we in this plan make recommendations that would strengthen the ability for people to be on the land? And that's where some of the thinking came from about Indigenous conservation economies, is that in order for people to spend time on the land, they need to be supported to do that. So in that plan, the Wildlife Conservation and Management Plan, was this recognition that there needed to be increased conservation and support in the area closest to Aullaviat, in this area called Aullaviat Anguniarvik. And so that conserved area it comes with a trust fund and some money to have guardians and activities happening in that area. So to Kiri's question, where did the theme come from? It was many years of thinking about how can we practically work to connect people to the land in a way that they're supported to do so. So we've been doing a lot of thinking in our corner of the world, the Yukon North Slope, about how to do that. And Billy will probably speak to that more with this agreement. But we thought it would be a good theme to also bring other people from across Canada together to see the thinking that they've been doing with respect to how can we create economies that also are good for conservation. And so when we think about economy, we don't often think about the word conservation. We often think about things like developments and mines and things like that. And so this is a way of flipping that around to say conservation can also be economical and good for the economy, good for people, and it's certainly good for the work that we do.
Yeah, one of the things I was super interested in from the press kit when you mentioned the trust fund and the fact that there were private donations as well in the philanthropic sector, I thought was super impressive. I haven't seen too many co-management agreements that could say they had those type of contributions, and would love to learn more about those donors and how that all evolved. I think it's probably a special model there for others to learn from.
During my time as game council when I sat on Game Council, I know we created some marine protected areas out in Beaufort, and then as we continued to have meetings in the community, about stuff, and then there was a little bit of exploration going on, in the Beaufort, and we had this agreement, marine protected areas that was connected to the communities, and we didn't really have any means or any funding, to go out and check on these areas while there were some activities out in the thing. So it finally one I wasn't actually sitting on the Aullaviat Community Corp or the Aullaviat HTC, and I guess they had gotten a letter and saying we want to meet and talk about withdrawal area, and that's what that area was known in the original land claim as. And so they said, we don't know very much about it, Billy. I know you've sat on the HTC for a long time, and we're wondering if you'd like to come and represent the Aullaviat HTC and the Community Corp in going out and talking with these people. So I said, I thought about it, and I said, yeah, I can do that. So they said, yeah, you never know, you might get $1 million, so we could do a little something down in the North Slope. So that's how it started out. I went for a few meetings, and I kind of got working with Lindsay quite a bit, and he had a vision, and he went out and he was talking to some donors, the possible donors. And then we're talking to Canada, and we know Canada has a commitment by 30-30 to have 30% of the Canada set aside for conservation. And we have this area that we can add to that, but it's going to cost them something, and figuring that, well, maybe we need to be able to go out and do a little monitoring on what people are doing, in this area, and being able to do some other things and get a little active on, just checking on all these on this area. So after about 6 or 8 years, we had all our ducks in a row, and we had all the parties. There was Canada in there, and there was Yukon government, and community of Aullaviat. And Aullaviat's the only one that really does anything on the Yukon North Slope. So that's our harvesting area. So we started negotiating along with IRC, which we pulled in, and we need their support, of course, to do this because it's in the ISR. So after a lot of meetings and some heartbreaks and thinking, well, this thing is going to drop, But what we ended up as we went along from meetings to meetings, about 6 years or 8 years was the total time, I guess, we spent on it. And so we had some worldwide funding, conservation organizations, and they were willing to put in some funding, to go towards this area. And so they ended up, I think we got 3.1 million, from these donors. And we talked to Canada, and Canada matched it 5-1. So all of a sudden we had 13.1 million. Mm-hmm. So then we start talking about all the programming that we're going to do and setting up a community organization that kind of looked after the thing. So we pulled in the Aullaviat Community Corp, the Aullaviat HTC, and the Aullaviat Elders Committee, the 3 Nunavut organizations in our community. And we worked and we created a working group. We gave it a new name. It's Aullaviat Anguniarvik. And just we set up this working group to work with the stuff that we had and with the IRC, and so then we needed some funding in the meantime before the trust fund would actually kick in. So Canada gave us just a little bit over 8 million in contribution agreements to get this thing started. So, and we're in our first year actually. We just had our signing on the 19th of June, and we had a big signing. We've already built 3 buildings, on the North Yukon coast, and they're all furnished and everything. We bought a bunch of equipment. We bought a boat and some snowmobiles and some quads to be able to go out and patrol this area. So, and then to go along with that, we also, set up, built into it some funding for community cultural events, to take place out in the land. So, and all this time, Lindsay worked along with myself, and our Yukon North Slope organization kind of stick handled all of the meetings and got the right people together and meeting time set up. And so, today we're glad that we have that done. We're just started our first program this year, so it's trying to play catch up, where I think we only spent about just over $1 million, but we just finally worked it out the other day, and we still have about $7 million to spend and get this thing rolling right. And we're in the early stages. We're trying to find some ideas on how we're going to roll out this monitoring, and we have a good idea of how we're going to do the cultural part. So we're excited. The community is all hyped up for this thing, and it does quite a bit for our economy in a community where there's not really any commodity. There's no economics in it. A lot of our people still trap, and hunt. We do all of that, but we'd never be able to do that full time because you'd never make it with the thing. So this type of a program is going to really help with the community. So
one of the things I was curious to learn from you, Billy, and where Jennifer was talking about, like, the animals got her initially interested, but then it was the people, and so much about this is relationships and so on. But at the same time, I'm really curious about the new protected area, and what are your thoughts on the caribou herds right now in Yukon, just where you were on the Porcupine Caribou Co-Management Board as well? Are things looking good or not? Or I'm just kind of curious to get an update on how things are, and if you think this new conservation area is going to help, and if so, in which ways? Because where I'm from, on the opposite part of the country in Labrador, it's been a rough decade with the George River caribou herd. So just interested to learn more about your thoughts on the caribou specifically there.
Our caribou herd is actually doing really well. I know when they listed all the rest of the herds in Canada. And an interesting note too is when I did my natural resources and technology, my thesis was on the George River herd. I know in 1953, which was the year I was born in, they had over 700,000, and they were down to 3,500 caribou then. And they have since grown up to close to 800,000 and dropped again. So, that's something that I think about that often, because, that this is what I'd had a little project on the George River herd, and I mean, it's amazing how these, how the numbers could fluctuate from, almost extinction to close to 750,000 and then back down. It's so, I mean, I hope our herd doesn't follow that routine because, in the last few years but they changed their route, for migrating. In the last few years, they haven't come as close to our community, but the numbers are still really high, and I think our last count was 2019, where we actually had a photo count, and we haven't had one since. There's been a few attempts and they've got some pretty good stabs at it, but never really got it. But we'll continue to try and get the counts. But I think, the caribou herd, I know our people, we have some other, like we have Dolly Varden Char that, in our area and along the Yukon North Slope. And the numbers are fluctuating, and we've been monitoring for years with the Aullaviat HTC. So we kind of set, some harvest quotas on them and just doing them voluntary, because that's a big part of the co-management process, where you don't want to put legislation, but when you work as a co-management board, you want to be able to, have community buy-in. That way, it's not a thing you have to police or anything. Our community is really willing to assist, and take part in all of these things and working with the co-management process. So, it's easy for our community to voluntarily, cut the numbers and let the numbers go back up, and then, we work on it. And over the years, we've been steadily increasing, and I think, it's a system that works. And I think, for the same thing and with the caribou, we've had the board's been proactive, in setting some numbers, and we've never really got out of the green since we created that system. And I think, but we've been, a lot of money and projects have been gone into just monitoring the progress of that herd, and just, where they're sitting, and, watching all the indicators and trying to be proactive and reacting, so we're not brought to what we are. So I think, we'll continue, being diligent on doing our monitoring. And I think, a lot of people, and looking back in the past, people were, a little concerned with collaring and stuff. But early in my trek to Game Council, my community of Aullaviat said, we're worried about, we're concerned about collaring these caribou because, you're creating a hardship on them. And so that was my first little task from the Aullaviat HTC, to go to Game Council and, to bring this up. And I quickly got sat down, and Game Council pulled aside by the chair, and, and a few of the other members, and they instilled in me and told me the reason why, if you can't monitor and know what these caribou are doing, then how you're going to do anything to prepare or to manage them. So since then, I've been, you have to do these things and be able to know what the herd is doing, where they are, and what's happening with them. And I think if you're in the management process of managing something, you need to know what they're doing. So it's been a big lesson for me. And I mean, now after all these years later, it is exactly what needs to be done.
And I'll just add this herd is really, really important to people, as many of the herds are across Canada. But this is the one that I'm most familiar with. And are there eight communities, Billy, that use the herd for their livelihood?
Yep.
So we call them Porcupine Caribou user communities. And they are so intimately tied to the health of this herd and invested in the health of the herd. And when Billy talks about the caribou being in the green, he's talking about a green management zone, which means that things are good. So we go from green to orange to yellow to red. So the caribou are in the green, and as he said, the most recent count was a bit over 200,000 animals, and people are really watching and caring about what is happening with this herd, and they require large tracts of intact land to travel on. Migratory herd, and it needs to be able to travel long distances and forage and eat different food in different locations. So, to your earlier question, Jamie, I think that this Aullaviat Anguniarvik conservation area provides for that intact landscape, and so that was a major driver of creating this. In addition to the other things that we've spoken about, and when you talk about wildlife, this area also has like abundant wildlife. So we're talking about polar bear, grizzly bear, caribou, muskox, wolverine, wolf, fur bears, dollyvard and char. There's lots of other species, but the porcupine caribou herd is a really, really pivotal one and key one for people. And Billy sits on the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, and that board also was established under the Aullaviat Final Agreement. And when I talk about kind of a strong vision in that agreement, that people at the time cared so much about this herd that they created a board specifically to manage it under the Aullaviat Final Agreement. And so, though all of our boards work on caribou, there is this one specific board that has a mandate to focus just on porcupine caribou. So we work closely together with them. And one more comment I wanted to make when Billy was speaking about voluntary quotas and measures like that. I think a really key piece about that is trust. And that's something that when you've been working for a long time, like he has and others have on these issues, and like he has around caribou, you build trust, and that's a key component to what makes co-management work so well. So you don't have to come in with regulations and restrictions, but you can talk to the people that you work with all the time and say, this is the reason why we need to do this, and people understand based on the science and the collar data, and also what harvesters and people who are in the land are saying. So you build that rapport of working together, and there's trust there, which really helps for managing these species.
You're listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Kiri Staples and David Silas. Enjoy the rest of the conversation, and thank you for caring about Indigenous co-management and honoring our treaties.
I was wondering if you could speak about the name Aullaviat Anguniarvik and where that comes from, what it means.
That's one for Billy.
I don't know if it's really one for Billy or not, because I know when we were working on the agreement and it was getting close to being signed, we put out a contest, and we had a young person and one of our elders that came up with the name, Aullaviat Anguniarvik. I think the thinking behind it was a place where people go to harvest, where the animals are. And so that's kind of the quick and short thing on that. But I know since the agreement has been signed, somebody has been saying that, well, now we're correcting that to, instead of 2 words, it's now 4. So I'm not sure on the other new wording of it. So, I'm not really versed in that, but I guess they'll continue to work on that and kind of get that straightened out. But I'll leave that to our linguistics.
So like Billy was saying, it covers where people travel and where the animals are, but according to some of the experts, it doesn't connect to the movement of where animals are. There need to be some words added. So like he said, we're still going back. The working group is working on that, but the meaning remains the same. And I think it's kind of a story about language revitalization and how that works over time, and how you have to work with that to really focus in on the meaning that you're trying to achieve. So there are people putting in their different views on which words need to be added and how they're pronounced. And so that's been a learning and interesting process. But what I will say is that having a name recognizing that area really feels a lot more significant than calling it the withdrawal area, like Billy spoke about. That's what it's called in the agreement, is the withdrawal area. And what does that really mean to people? So this new name is really important for recognizing the area for what it is, which is a place where people spend their time harvesting and also where the animals are.
So one of the other things that you mentioned, Jen, earlier when we were speaking about caribou is about how this area is part of a broader landscape. And I don't think it was until the signing agreement that I saw a map of how this protected area fits in with some of the surrounding protected areas. So I'm wondering if you could just provide a little bit of context around how this protected area is essentially a piece of a puzzle in a broader landscape.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, as a piece of a puzzle. So I spoke about how these migratory species, especially porcupine caribou, require a lot of land. That's really what keeps them healthy. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why the herd in our region is doing so well, is it's largely undeveloped land. And so when we talk about the pieces of the puzzle, there are a number of areas that are protected in one way or another. And starting in Alaska, there's a really large amount of land called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which has different levels of conservation and protection. And so when we use those words, they mean different things. And listeners have probably heard of the 1002 lands, and that's an area of land within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge where caribou often calve. It's a super important area. It's also an important area for oil and gas development. And so that kind of activity is allowed in that portion of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So that's a whole nother podcast, but I just mentioned that there is a large amount of land that is protected in some way on the Alaskan side, and with the exception of these lands that we call the 1002 lands. But because we know that these caribou require so much land, that was another reason for saying, well, there are some things we can't control across the border, and we can't control what the political interests are doing, and we can't control necessarily what's happening in those 1002 lands. But what we can do on our side of the border is ensure that land in northern Canada is relatively conserved or protected. And so part of the reason for Aullaviat, Anguniarvik. But going kind of from west to east, we have the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and then we cross the border into Canada, and there's a national park, Aullaviat National Park. And the creation of that park was largely to protect calving grounds and kind of the birthing place, which is what that name means for porcupine caribou. And then you keep moving east, and we've got Aullaviat Anguniarvik now as a contiguous area of conservation designations. And then going further south, you have the Old Crow Flats and then Vuntut National Park. Those are areas established under the Vuntut-Gwitchin final agreement as important areas for them. And then there's a couple of other what they call special management areas in the Vuntut-Gwitchin traditional territory, Dadzaivan, and I'm not remembering the name of the other one at the moment, but the map that you spoke to, Kyria's, shows all of those areas connected. And when you look at that map, you can then kind of see and visualize how porcupine caribou could move through that landscape relatively undisturbed. One other point I wanted to just make about protected areas is we've had a lot of discussion about that word and that term protected. And like I alluded to, it means different things to different people. And one of the things that we were clear about doing was calling this a traditional conservation area. So it's not a protected area in the sense of a national park. It's a traditional conservation area, meaning that there's a lot of things that still happen in that land, and people are very connected to that land. So it's not like we're taking it off of the map and saying nobody goes there. It's all about being used in the right ways that support conservation.
Thanks for that, Jen. I just have to report on the Porcupine Caribou. I agree. It could be totally its own podcast. It reminded me of a story that Tony Pennicott once told me about, probably in the 80s, when they were down in Washington with a bunch of folks from some Buntut Gwich'in folks and other Gwich'in folks advocating for the protection of Anwar. And they had met with a now famous U.S. politician, Bernie Sanders, and gave him their pitch. And he clearly didn't know a lot about the area, because at the end he said, well, I think both caribou and porcupine should be protected. No, I should say that's just a story. I don't know if it's true. So for the liability reasons, maybe I'll put a disclaimer on that. But anyways, so yeah, thanks for providing that. I'm wondering if you can speak to, you had mentioned a management plan, and I wonder if you wanted to give us a little bit more insight into how that management plan was developed and what it's trying to achieve.
Yeah, sure. I'll start and Billy can chime in. This management plan is not the first one that the council's produced. It's the second version, actually. So there was one that was recommended in about 2003. And a lot has changed on the landscape since that time. So I think sitting around the co-management table, people are saying we're seeing a ton of change. And not only is the land changing, but a lot changed since 2003 with land claims in the Yukon and different government structures and co-management structures. So the plan clearly needed an update. And so, but one of the big things that it recognizes and focuses on is how much the landscape is changing as a result of climate related impacts to the land. So in doing that early thinking, I think we took the approach of kind of the three areas that the Wildlife Management Advisory Council is charged to make recommendations for. So wildlife, habitat, and Aullaviat traditional use. So what are the requirements for all three of those things to be in good health? What do we need to know about wildlife? What do we need to know about habitat? And what do we need to know about Aullaviat traditional use? So that plan was about 8-ish years of work, both scientific and traditional and Indigenous knowledge studies, to collect together what we would kind of call the requirements of those three areas. And then the plan then goes, so it documents that, and then it goes further to make some recommendations about those areas. If we're going to have an intact landscape and, across all of these areas, what do we need to do? How do we need to manage that land? And then that connects to this Aullaviat Anguniarvik area. That was one of the key recommendations of the plan, was this particular area needs an elevated status to make this, as you spoke about earlier, puzzle piece kind of complete. And I guess the other thing that I was thinking maybe Billy could speak to is the involvement of the Hunters and Trappers Committee and the community of Aullaviat throughout the development of the plan. They sat at the table and guided a lot of that work.
Yeah. And I think, back in the early days of developing the conservation plan, we talked about how we could try and protect the area and to protect the animals and stuff in the area. So, that was our prime interest and our goal early in the times, and when we had an actual early version of that was before I even got there, that was developed, and there's different levels of protection, in the lands. And I know back early when I got on it, I know we were talking about it, and Lindsay would come to Aullaviat, and say, that we have this and we need to update it. And I know a couple of times that Yukon government had it came up, I guess, in their legislature that they were going to allow some activity, and do something with the gold mining and thing. We had people that were up and coming and going up in the mountains, and collecting rock samples and stuff like that, and kind of leading towards maybe opening this area up to development. So I know Lindsay came to Aullaviat and we went through, and it was designated back then as a Category E lands, or anyways, we upgraded the category to no development, and we did that to kind of block that, and Yukon government kind of went away and gave up on the idea of maybe doing some development. And then there was a big election in the U.S. where they came up, and Donald Trump was opening it up to, to selling off blocks of land. And I know we really had no way to kind of battle that one. So what we did, or some people did, that we assessed it was, we went to the big companies themselves, like Imperial Oil and all the big oil companies, and we, said, this area needs to be protected because that's our calving area for the Porcupine Caribou Herd, and so we I know PCMB had some people that were doing some walks, in Washington and stuff, and I know at Aullaviat we were doing our part to try and raise the category on these lands, and then the PCMB was also sending folks, to talk with the big banks in Canada for not funding, or backing this type of thing. So what ended up is the banks wouldn't back anybody, and the only one, I guess, organization that was left holding any kind of a permit was an Indigenous group in Alaska, and so kind of the interest got shaken off, and then after Donald Trump was gone, they kind of, it was lost again, but you never know, what started out, I think, maybe as a big joke in the U.S. is not such a big joke because he might be getting in again, So we continue to monitor and, just make sure that we have ways and means to get our voices out there and to be heard and to, and continue to work to protect this area as best we can. And I think, we work well in the co-management regime, and we have a lot of support. We have people going and talking to these big senators in the U.S., and just getting their support. And it doesn't take much to kind of swing it so where it won't happen. So we continue to battle, and I think it's going to be always that way. But I mean, we manage to the best of our ability, and I think, I don't know, I just wish that our young leaders that are coming up behind us are as diligent as we are to try and to keep this conservation area true and pristine.
That's right. And I'll just mention that another tool that we have on the Yukon North Slope is the IFA, in that it recommends for a special conservation regime across the Yukon North Slope. So that's one of the ways that the council has been able to work with other partners to raise the profile of conservation in that area. When I talk about vision of the IFA, that was more than 40 years ago, but really the thinking around conservation of this important area began well before that. And it began with people who lived in the area, and they started to see some pressure of oil and gas development in the Beaufort Sea. And at that time, people started to get together and say, we need to do something about this. We need to start having conversations around a land claim. And we need to make sure that this area is protected for our people for time to come. So that vision started a long time ago. And during that time, it was recognized and recommended that the entire Yukon North Slope should be some kind of protected area. And it was actually recommended to be a national park across the whole top of the Yukon North Slope. And that was largely because of porcupine caribou and what Billy was speaking about are these development pressures across the border in Alaska. And at that time, through negotiations, it was decided that about half of that area, Aullaviat National Park, would be protected in the national park status. And then the other part of that would be this thing called a withdrawal order, which really didn't hold a lot of meaning in terms of its name, but it was withdrawn from development. And so ever since then, since the signing of the IFA in 84, that area has been a little bit of a gray zone with respect to what's allowed to happen there and what's not allowed to happen there. And so when we talk about this agreement that was penned on June 19th, I see that as completing that work of the IFA vision from 40 years ago to say, this is how we see this area being used. It now falls under the special conservation regime that was identified in the IFA. And here are a set of tools for how to manage that area with this management plan and also with this Guardian program and with Indigenous leadership under Aullaviat Anguniarvik.
Yeah, well, thanks for providing that history, Jen, because as you know, I was very fortunate to go to the signing ceremony in June in Aullaviat, and I felt very privileged to just be witnessed to the joy that you could really feel in the community and I think that speaks to how long and hard of a road it was for folks to put that in place, and it was palpable in the room. You could feel it, and so I was very fortunate to be part of that. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so we can wrap up our conversation. And but thank you both so much for the time that you shared today and your willingness to help folks learn about some of the work that you're doing up in the North Slope and elsewhere. So thank you.
Thanks, Curie. Check out our website, wmac.ca. And stay tuned for information about our upcoming Yukon North Slope Conference in January this year.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation.